30. Bad facts is a phrase defense lawyers like to bandy about. It's a term that's meant to draw an epistemological distinction between what is objectively real and what is subjective opinion. Simply because the prosecutors say it's true, well, that doesn't make it so. And in Moscow, a supposedly open and shut case was starting to loom as a lot more open than shut. At least that's what the defense team had been excitedly whispering to one another, according to several people privy to their deliberations. Give the state's much-vaunted evidence a couple of good swift kicks, and it would break apart. A litany of doubts had slowly taken a foreboding shape. Consider, the DNA on the knife's sheath snap? It's touch DNA. That is, it was derived from a fingerprint rather than a drop of blood. And that's pretty shaky evidence. The courtroom reality was that in case after case, touch DNA had been tarnished by a motley collection of false positive results. A smart defense attorney might argue that there was just as much likelihood of touch DNA's being accurate as a juror's winning the lottery. Who'd want to condemn someone to execution based on those odds? The car videos? There was no image of the driver in any of them, and there was not a single shot that displayed a license plate. None. And that meant that there was nothing that definitively put Kohberger at the wheel or demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that it was his car. After all, there were a lot of Hyundai Elantras on the road besides Kohberger's. And adding to the muddle, it had taken the FBI 3 tries before they'd settled on a vehicle year for the car. There had been a string of miscalculations, and a jury might not be very forgiving. The cell tower triangulations? Peel away the well-documented limitations of the process, and Kohberger's phone could be placed anywhere within a 13-mile radius of the murder house, and that's about as definitive as a suspicion, not a certainty. The eyewitness identification? Well, a lot of people have bushy eyebrows like the intruder, not just the suspect. Besides, testimony from a witness who was frozen and in shock, as Dylan Mortensen had been bluntly characterized in a police affidavit, would be easy to impugn, especially by a defense attorney who had bushy eyebrows. The murder weapon? Where was it? The police had not found the long-bladed knife used in the killings, and so far they had not revealed whether they had been able to establish that Kohberger ever owned such a weapon. The motive? The timeline narrative the prosecution had been chasing owed as much to clairvoyance as psychology. Speculative psychobabble at best. And such wispy conjecture would never sway a practical-thinking Idaho jury. And as for wily Bill Thompson, well, the wag said, the Biden presidency had made one truth uncomfortably clear. Experienced was just another word for old. The defense was now emboldened. They went on the offensive and began hammering away at the foundations of the state's argument. And in the process, they posed an incendiary question that had the potential to burn the case against Kohberger down to the ground. What if there was another story out there? The defense asked. Another version of what had happened that night. There were large, lingering mysteries that the prosecution had refused to address, and the defense was now very pointedly working to make the case that these inconvenient truths, when lined up end to end, hinted at another, still untold story, and that another disturbing possibility existed. Going back over the events, the timeline for the murders had all along seemed tricky at best. The prosecution had most recently asserted that the killer had done his work in a brutally effective 8 minutes, from 4:02 to about 4:10 a.m. Do the grim mathematics, and it worked out to an efficient 2 minutes per victim, and each pair was hunkered down for the night on separate floors. Could a single assassin, a graduate student, not a sicario, get the job done with such disciplined professionalism? Then disappear into the night without leaving a single drop of blood in the house, in his car, on his clothes, or in his apartment? The stunned cops who arrived on the scene had described what they had encountered as a bloodbath. Was this lack of blood evidence testimony to the killer's fastidiousness, or a prod to go down other ruminative paths? The coroner had reassured Steve Gonsalves that his brave daughter had fought back like a tiger, and yet no traces of cuts, scrapes, or bruises were observed on Kohberger. 4 young, fit targets, and he somehow traipsed away with his pasty skin as smooth and unblemished as any sedentary academic's? It didn't seem possible. And what about the coroner's autopsy reports? What was behind the delay in the determination of Ethan's wounds? The autopsy was performed on November 17th, but the report on his death was not issued for nearly a month, on December 15th. Had there been a problem in reaching the findings, a final analysis that had been subject to debate? A further troubling fact: the coroner's description of the wounds, as noted in court documents, seemed to differ from floor to floor in the house. Kaylee and Maddie, lying in the same bed on the third floor, suffered visible stab wounds. Yet on the floor below, Xana succumbed to wounds caused by an edged weapon. Ethan's were caused by sharp focus injuries. Was there some doubt in the coroner's mind that the wounds were all caused by the same weapon? But these suspicions were just preludes to the bigger mysteries the defense, no longer passive, was now shouting out loud. In an objection to State's motion for protective order, the team zeroed in on several lingering questions. It was a revelatory document, and a provocative one. It insightfully pointed out that back in the early stages of the case, the prosecution had been made aware of 2 additional males' DNA found inside the King Road house, as well as male DNA on a glove found outside the residence just days after the murders. If the DNA had been Kohberger's, the prosecution would have been trumpeting this revelation. The State's stony silence, the defense believed, could only mean one thing: the DNA came from 3 other men, and that left an obvious yet very pertinent question unanswered. Who are they, and how do these 3 unknown men fit into the horrific events of that night? And there was more. The motion dramatically threw a lit match at another powder keg. Quite effectively, it demolished several tantalizing press reports. Forget the fanciful stories about online direct messages between Kohberger and one of the victims. Forget the alleged run-in at a Main Street Moscow restaurant where Maddie and Xana had worked. The defense categorically asserted that there is no connection between Mr. Kohberger and the victims. And if there was no connection, then there was no plausible motive. And without a motive, the random brutal killings of the 4 college students by a grad student from a nearby university remained an enigma. Why did he do it? There wasn't an answer because the prosecution's story just didn't make sense. But there was still another mystery at the heart of this case. Namely, the 8-hour gap between when Dylan Mortensen had first heard the disquieting noises in the house, "There's someone here," and spotted a masked black-dressed intruder, and when the police were finally summoned. 8 hours. There had been a lot of agile, emphatic explanations offered to explain away this remarkable delay, and none so far, the defense believed, had been satisfactory, or had the ring of truth. And so the defense's strategy had now taken a new shape, a new direction. The accumulated doubts had worked to liberate them from simply poking holes in the prosecution's case. With this freedom, they began to explore new narratives, alternative versions of what might have happened that fateful night in November on King Road. And if Kohberger wasn't the killer, or if he was an accomplice rather than the sole perpetrator, then they realized they had to go back to what had been previously brushed over. They had to work their way to an explanation that made sense. And that trail led inexorably to drugs.